Welcome everybody to the second of the bonus lectures on the history of Israel. Now in the previous lecture we looked at the history of Israel from Abraham to the time of the Judges. Let's now pick up the story from the time of Israel's first human king, Saul. Now after Israel rejected God as king and Saul was chosen, God gave him a special mission to avenge Israel from the trouble caused by the Amalekites. Now the campaign would also free Egypt of the hated Hyksos and allow Israel to gain dominance over their neighbours and prosper in the time of the kings. Now Josephus gives us the best evidence that the Hyksos were actually the Amalekites. Now he makes this statement about Saul's campaign, which makes it clear that the bulk of the Amalekites were based in Egypt. Now he wrote, "But when Saul had conquered all these Amalekites that reached from Pelusium of Egypt to the Red Sea, he laid waste all the rest of the enemy's country. Together with Saul's army, the native Theban dynasty from southern Egypt were able to take back control of Egypt and were able to become a great power again." Now let's closely examine the biblical text with regards to the campaign against Amalek by Saul. We read in 1 Samuel 15, "And Samuel said to Saul, 'The Lord sent me to anoint you to be king over his people, over Israel. And now listen to the voice of the words of the Lord. So says the Lord of hosts, I will visit Amalek with what he did to Israel, how he set against him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and completely destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass.' And Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 footmen and 10,000 of Judah. And Saul came to a city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. And Saul said to the Kenites, 'Go, depart, get down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the sons of Israel when they came up out of Egypt.' So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. And Saul struck the Amalekites from Havilah as you come to Shur, which is against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and he completely destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatlings and of the lambs, and all that was good, and would not completely destroy them. But everything that was vile and feeble they completely destroyed." Now here are some points that we can draw from this. First of all, the number of soldiers was 210,000. Now this is a major expeditionary force. Now this is comparable to D-Day, where 150,000 men landed on the beaches of Normandy. This was not a small war against attacking raiders. Now the direction of this war was from Havilah, Arabia, to Shur, Egypt's defensive war, indicating the two main bases of Amalekite power. Now when Saul got to Shur, Egypt's defensive wall, with his massive expeditionary force, did they stop there or penetrate into Egypt and destroy the Hyksos there? Well, the fact that they brought back lots of livestock, unlikely of finding a target on the Sinai Peninsula, and the fact that they brought back King Agag at the end of the campaign in Shur very strongly argues in favour of them going into Egypt. Now the lack of reference, I should say, to the foreign efforts in the Egyptian records is no proof that the Israelites weren't involved. Now the Egyptians were hardly ever going to give credit to the Israelites in their records of the siege, even as many Americans today do not give sufficient credit to the Russians for their part in defeating Germany in World War II. Karmos and Amos would have known about the Israelites' campaign in Havilah and knew they were coming to Egypt. This would have provided the perfect timing for them to attack the Hyksos at the same time that the Israelites got to Shur. They may have even been the ones to let them in past the border into Egypt. Now an additional possibility is that Israel attacked Pelusium, as explicitly noted by Josephus, while Karmos and Amos were attacking Avaris And then after destroying Pelusium, they helped the Egyptians finish off Avaris, including capturing King Agag. Now Agag, as Velikovsky points out, is extremely close to Apop. Now, Apop II is conventionally believed to be the last Hyksos ruler. Now you don't go that far towards Egypt with such a large force if you're not going to go into Egypt and break the Amalekite power base there. And the capture of King Agag in the Shur part of the campaign strongly supports that. Now without the Amalekite support given to its neighbours, Israel was able to, through the wars of Saul and David, to defeat the neighbouring nations that had held Israel down, and Israel was able to expand to its greatest heights during the reign of King Solomon. Now the strange irony is that Saul was instrumental in helping free Egypt from its 400-year domination by the Hyksos, and military speaking was a great hero, yet he is only remembered for his disobedience to God, such as sparing Agag and keeping the spoil. Now King David was the next king after Saul. Now it was in his reign, following his time with the Philistines, and then bringing them under Israelite hegemony, that the Philistine monopoly over iron was broken, which had gone all the way back to the time Israel first counted the Philistines after the Exodus. Now from having little or no iron, David was later able to prepare iron without measure for the temple. Now critics of David's existence were silenced when part of a victory stela of an Aramaean king was found at Tel Dan, announcing that he has subdued the king from the house of David. Now King David wanted to complete the conquest of Canaan begun by Joshua. Now first of all he beat the Jebusites and captured Jerusalem, which became his new capital. He also subdued the nations around Israel, which are recounted in 2 Samuel 8 and repeated in 1 Chronicles 18, starting with attacking and defeating the Philistines. Now the land of Moab was outside the territory of what was promised to Israel. However, it seems highly likely that certain of the Moabites were proving a menace to Israel, based on David picking out certain ones he felt needed to be executed. Moab became a tributary to Israel. Now David also brought Syrian territory that was within the promised land inheritance under the control of Israel, before also making Ammon and Edom tributaries of Israel. Now in 1 Chronicles 19 we read about Ammon that was put under tribute to David rebelling. Now what is particularly interesting is the help provided by the Mesopotamians, who are probably the Assyrians. Now the Syrians and the Mesopotamians provided 32,000 chariots to assist Ammon in its rebellion against David. Now the highest number of chariots David is mentioned as taking out to war was only 1,000. Now David's empire had not gone unnoticed by the Assyrians. Now Psalm 83 describes this ancient battle. We read in Psalm 83, "They have said, 'Come, let us put an end to them as a nation, so that the name of Israel may go out of man's memory. For they have all come to an agreement. They are all joined together against you, the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagarites, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, the Philistines and the people of Tyre. Asher is joined with them. They have become the support of the children of Lot.'" Now Asher here are the Assyrians or Mesopotamians who have engaged in fighting a proxy war against Israel. This great coalition has come to support the children of Lot, that is the Ammonites who have rebelled against David, and these other nations wanted to wipe Israel out. So Israel found itself fighting a two-front war on the north and the east, but incredibly they still managed to defeat this huge army. Now the Syrians were broken first before the Ammonites were then defeated. The Assyrians would not make any more serious forays into Israel's territory for nearly a couple of hundred years. Now my own church sees Psalm 83 as a prophecy for the end time, though there is really nothing in the psalm that would indicate that. Now, the conclusion that they reached was done on the basis of not seeing this fulfilled in ancient times. However, when properly analysed, you can see that it was indeed fulfilled in the time of David's reign. Now, David Down and John Ashton, in their book Unwrapping the Pharaohs, write the following: by the revised chronology proposed by Velikovsky and Corville, Thutmose I would be contemporary with King Solomon of Israel. And in 1 Kings 3:1 we are told that Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. The unnamed Pharaoh who gave his daughter, Nefertiti, to Solomon bestowed on her a rather unusual dowry gift. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and taken Giza and burnt it with fire, had killed the Canaanites who dwelt in the city, and had given it as a dowry to his daughter Solomon's wife. Now, Giza has been thoroughly excavated by archaeologists over the years. A deep shaft has been cut through the centre of the tell. It has exposed a thick layer of black ash where the city was thoroughly burned by fire. Beneath this ash is pottery belonging to the Canaanite period. End of quote. Now you can see here on the right, the bottom right, that the fire was so intense that the stones were melted and deformed. Now the alliance with Egypt was sealed by a political marriage of Thutmose I's daughter Nefertiti with Solomon, one of his eventual tally of 300 wives, some of whom would have also been political marriages. Now Solomon's legendary harem of 300 wives and 700 concubines was a sad testimony to his unbridled sexual appetite that made him the Hugh Hefner of the ancient world. Now Solomon ruled a mighty empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt. Now he is said in the Bible to have built Tadmor in the wilderness in 1 Kings 9 verse 18. Now Tadmor today is Palmyra, an ancient city whose temples were recently demolished by ISIS. Now in addition to allying himself with Egypt, Solomon expanded this to a triple alliance with Israel, Phoenicia and Egypt. Now most historians don't realise that the Israelites formed a significant part of what history records as the Phoenician shipping empire, as Stephen Collins documents in his book Israel's Lost Empires, the second of a 4-book series on the history of Israel. Now this shipping empire formed the colony of Carthage. It had trading links with Tarshish in Spain and Britain, and even sailed to the New World, it appears, even in Solomon's time. Now Thutmose III of Egypt was followed by his son Thutmose II. Now the marriage of Thutmose II with HATSHEPSUT produced no sons, but Thutmose had a secondary wife named Isis, who produced a son called also Thutmoses, and he was crowned as Thutmose III, but he was only about 12 years of age when his father Thutmose II died, so HATSHEPSUT assumed the role of regent on his behalf. Now Queen HATSHEPSUT effectively then became a pharaoh. Now Velikovsky proposed that HATSHEPSUT was the legendary Queen of Sheba who came to visit Solomon. Now as to her identification with the Queen of Sheba, Alan Montgomery writes in his article, The Queen of Sheba, Velikovsky versus Bimson. Velikovsky thought HATSHEPSUT's son Thutmose III invaded Israel in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, the son of King Solomon. The invading pharaoh is named Pharaoh Shishak in the Bible. Thus, of the 21 years of HATSHEPSUT's reign, only her first 17 years overlapped Solomon. Prior to her reign, her husband Thutmose II reigned from the 5th to the 23rd year of Solomon. The visit of the Queen of Sheba followed the construction of the temple and Solomon's palace in Jerusalem in the 20th year of Solomon's reign. So at that point in time, Thutmose II was Pharaoh, not HATSHEPSUT. She was only the chief wife of Pharaoh at that time. Her title, Queen of Sheba, might refer to Cush, Nubia, Sheba being the grandson of Cush. Now, supporting this connection between Ethiopia and Sheba, Josephus, in the account of Moses' life as the Prince of Egypt, makes reference to Sheba as the capital of the Ethiopians. Now, Sheba may have been a title she held while her husband still reigned, much like the title Prince of Wales held by the heir to the British throne. Now, Emmett Sweeney, in his book Empire of Thebes, feels that Thebes was also known as Shewa, which is also very close to Sheba. Now, Josephus also tells us in Antiquities of the Jews that there was then a woman, Queen of Egypt and Ethiopia, and then he proceeds to describe the visit by the Queen of Sheba as described in the Bible. The Ethiopian Kebra Nagast, the Book of the Glory of Kings, discusses the Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon and calls her Makeda, almost identical to the royal name of Queen HATSHEPSUT, which was Makira, used repeatedly in the Deir el-Bahari mortuary complex inscriptions of her trading mission to Punt. Now, the Late Bronze Age is normally dated to around 1200 BC. Now, as a result of that dating, the reign of Solomon is believed to have been in the Iron Age II period. Now, the archaeological remains from the Iron Age II period show a level of poverty in the land of Israel at this time, and so little is seen in archaeology to support Solomon's reign as a golden era of prosperity in Israel. Now, by redating the Late Bronze Age, that is the time that's equivalent to Egypt's New Kingdom, to a later time, including the time of Solomon, better archaeological evidence is able to be matched up with the Bible's view of Solomon's reign being one of great prosperity. Now, one example is found at Megiddo, which David Roll points out in a series of lectures that he gave that are available at the Patterns of Evidence website. Now, there is a large Late Bronze Age palace found at Stratum 8 at Megiddo. The conventional chronology assigns this to Akhenaten, and it is given a date of 1300 BC, which would place it in the time of the Judges, or before, to the time of the Canaanites, depending on which date one uses for the Exodus. Now, both David Roll and VELIKOVSKY'S chronologies would place this palace around 950 BC, in the time of Solomon. Now, where this Late Bronze palace is, there is a beautifully worked city gate with cut or ashkeler stones. Now, when you read how his palace in Jerusalem was built in 1 Kings 7, it says that there were 3 courses of cut or dressed stone, and in between these was a course of cedar beams to assist with preventing destruction from earthquakes. Now, this is exactly the same pattern of stonework we see at this gate here in Megiddo. Now, there is one thing found at the excavations at Megiddo that is out of place in David Roll's chronology if we assume that this Strata 8 palace was the Palace of Solomon. Now, David Roll would place the time of Solomon when this palace was built during the reign of Seti the Great of the 19th dynasty. Now, Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty, who included Megiddo in his list of conquered cities, ruled before Seti the Great, when David Roll claims the palace was built. Yet, a seal of Thutmose III was found in a higher layer than the palace, which would imply that Thutmose III ruled after, not before King Solomon. Now, the standard line from Egyptologists when they find such seals or scarabs that are out of place is that they were handed down as heirlooms and found in later levels. Now, while this later deposition may be valid at times, more often such seals are deposited at the same time as other artifacts of the same king. Now, VELIKOVSKY believed that Thutmose III was the biblical Shishak because of the match of his treasures on a wall at the Temple of Karnak with items so similar in nature as Solomon's temple. Now, if Thutmose III is the biblical Shishak, then the seal of Thutmose III found in Stratum 7b is exactly where it should be. Now, inside this palace at Megiddo, we've found a hoard of treasures which are usually attributed as being Canaanite, not Israelite. Now, in a test of time, David Roll states, this magnificent hoard included gold vessels, jewellery of different styles, including gold and lapis lazuli beads, and a collection of ivory plaques. Now, one such ivory plaque has particularly piqued David Roll's interest. Now, he notes that you can see on this ivory the Queen offering an Egyptian lotus flower, an Egyptian-style lion sphinx on his throne, and a winged sun disk above the chariot. Now, these Egyptian items are not out of place, since Solomon married an Egyptian princess and fell into idolatry late in his reign. Now, we also see doves, which are a symbol of peace, which Solomon's name means, being a variation of shalom. Now, might this actually be Solomon seated on his throne? Well, I think there's a very good chance that it actually could be. And 1 Kings 9 and verse 15, it mentions how Solomon built at Hyksos, Megiddo, and Gezer. Now, at each of these sites there are 6 chambered gates with cut ashlar stone. Now, the similarity of design here suggests a central government that stretched from the north to the south of Israel. Now, on a documentary called The Bible's Buried Secrets, they interviewed Eliot Mazar, who has been excavating at the city of David, south of the Temple Mount. Now, her team uncovered walls 3 to 5 metres thick and at least 30 metres long and several stories high near the entrance to the City of David tourist attraction. Now, this represents a huge building in this location, and she believes it to be the royal palace. Now, pottery and radiocarbon dating of organic remains points to a date somewhere within the range of King David and Ahab. Now, Kathleen Kenyon in 1961, following her time at Jericho, excavated the eastern slopes of the City of David. Now, she had found a vast stone terracing system which stretched along the east scarp of the old city. Now, it's been estimated that this extension of the city summit added at least 6,000 square metres to the occupational area of early Jerusalem. Now, she initially believed it to be Solomon's Millo until pottery was found that was contemporary with the time of Amenhotep III, who is believed to have reigned 400 years before King Solomon. Now, the revised chronology places Amenhotep III after Solomon, so there's no obstacle to believing that this was the work done during Solomon's reign. Now, after Solomon died, Jeroboam returned to Israel and led a revolt against the Israel crown over high taxation that split the nation into 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, weakening the kingdom. Now, the division into 2 kingdoms occurred around 929 BC, according to my chronology. Now, Jeroboam became king of the 10 tribes in the north, while Solomon's son, Rehoboam, became king of Judah with its capital in Jerusalem, which also included the tribes of Benjamin and Levi. Now, a major event where Egypt's and Israel's history intersects is where Pharaoh Shishak plundered the temple in Jerusalem in the days of King Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Now, a major synchronism with the Bible was established by Champollion, the Frenchman who deciphered the Rosetta Stone. Now, on the outside of the temple of Karnak in Thebes is a relief of Palestinian cities paying tribute to the 22nd dynasty king Shishak I, who was from one of the Libyan dynasties of the period of foreign rule in Egypt, known as the Third Intermediate Period. Now, Champollion, in his excitement, saw the similarity of the name of Shishak I with the pharaoh called Shishak in the Bible, who plundered the temple around 923 BC, soon after Solomon died. And that synchronism, based purely on a similarity of name, has stuck ever since. Now, upon closer examination, the cities paying tribute are only from northern Israel, not Judah, which is the reverse of the account of Shishak's conquest in the Bible, as it was Judah, not Israel, that was conquered. Now, most revisionist chronologies support the placement of the Exodus at the end of the Middle Kingdom during the 13th dynasty. Now, amongst those who have proposed revised Egyptian chronologies, various candidates have been put forth as the biblical Shishak, including Ramses the Great by David Roll and Ramses III by Peter James. Now, the candidate who has the best evidence, I feel, for being the biblical Shishak is the pharaoh proposed by Emmanuel VELIKOVSKY, Thutmose III of the mid-18th dynasty. Now, the Shishak first inscription is found on an outer wall of the Temple of Karnak in Luxor, or Thebes, as it is anciently called. Now, inside this very same temple in Karnak is another relief, a much larger bas-relief of Thutmose III offering a huge cache of objects to the god Amun. Now, in our Ages in Chaos, VELIKOVSKY writes the following: the treasures brought by Thutmose III from Palestine are reproduced on a wall on the Karnak temple. The bas-reliefs display in 10 rows the legendary wealth of Solomon. There are pictures of various precious objects, furnishings, vessels, and utensils of the temple, of the palace, probably also of the shrines of foreign deities. Under each object, a numerical symbol indicates how many of that kind were brought back by the Egyptian king from Palestine. Now, each stroke means 1 piece, each arch means 10 pieces, each spiral 100 pieces of the same thing. If Thutmose III had wanted to boast and display all his spoils from the temple and the palace of Jerusalem by showing each object separately, instead of using this number system, a wall a mile long would have been required, and even that would have not sufficed. In the upper 5 rows, the objects of gold are presented. In the next rows, silver things are mingled with those of gold and precious stones. Objects of bronze and semi-precious stones are in the lower rows. Gods were often depicted in Egyptian temples in shameless positions. Among the figures of sacred objects on the Karnak bas-relief, there are none in phallic form. Neither are there pictures of gods at all. Now, a few animal heads, lions, with the sign of the uraeus on their foreheads and the head of a hawk, are wrought on the lids of some cups. These cups may have been brought forth from the palace Solomon had built for his Egyptian wife. Now, the bas-relief displays what appears to be the legendary wealth of Solomon's age, including vessels and utensils of the temple, the golden altar, the brazen altar, the showbread, gold and silver, and the candlesticks. Now, some examples of the temple booty on this relief include an exact match of 100 basins of gold and 300 shields of gold to what was in the temple according to the Bible. And this argues very strongly in favour of the items being one and the same as the treasure taken by Shishak from the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, in Ages in Chaos, VELIKOVSKY does an excellent forensic analysis comparing what is in the Bible regarding the temple treasures, and the relief of Thutmose III, and they do make quite a remarkable match. Now, Alan Montgomery notes a couple of other additional supporting proofs in his article, The Queen of Sheba, VELIKOVSKY versus Bimson. He writes, Thutmose III inscribed his campaigns on the walls of a temple at Karnak. He explained that the Asiatics had fallen into disagreement, which might refer to the rebellion of King Jeroboam, splitting Israel into 2 kingdoms, Israel and Judah. According to the Septuagint, when Jeroboam had fled to Egypt, Shishak had given him an Egyptian princess named Ano for a wife. Princess Ano's name appears on an 18th dynasty visceral jar. The jar stylistically is dated to the late 15th century, several decades after the death of Thutmose III. No other Princess Ano is known in Egyptian history. Now in Chronicles 22:14 it states that David had prepared 100,000 talents of gold for the temple. Now there are 30 kilos in a talent, so 100,000 talents is over 3,000 tons of gold. Now that's almost as much gold as is reported in Fort Knox. Now if Ramses the Great, well known for his boasting, had plundered the temple of God as believed by David Roll and took back that phenomenal amount of gold, there would certainly have been a great boast showing all the treasures of the temple on some temple wall as well, like Thutmose III's at the Temple of Karnak. And the same applies for Peter James's Shishak candidate Ramses III in his temple at Medinet Habu. Now the lack of such a booty record by these two pharaohs named Ramses is very telling in determining just who the real biblical Shishak was. Now David Roll has Ramses II of the 19th dynasty as the biblical Shishak, and he has Thutmose III as contemporary with Samuel and the late Judges period. Now Peter James also places Thutmose III contemporary with the earlier period of the Judges. So if Thutmose III conquered Israel in the time of the Judges, as believed by those two British scholars, would Israel have accumulated that phenomenal amount of gold, over 3,000 tons, in the more feudal period of the Judges, when they were often invaded by the neighbours to the point where they asked for a king? I think not. And why is there no record of Egypt under Thutmose III during the time of the Judges, as placed by James and Roll, conquering Israel in the Bible, given so many other foreign invaders are noted in the book of Judges? Now David Roll has been able to provide evidence showing Ramses the Great came to Jerusalem, but his one inscription pales in comparison to the number of exact and close matches on the Thutmose III relief and the biblical account of the temple treasures plundered that VELIKOVSKY cites supporting Thutmose III of the mid-18th dynasty being the Shishak of the Bible. Now Thutmose III saw the power vacuum that occurred after Solomon died, and Israel was weakened when it split into two kingdoms. Now, he lusted for power and riches, and he launched an offensive into Israel and Syria, and he brought most of what was Solomon's empire under his control. Thutmose III conquered all the way to the Euphrates, taking over the empire of Solomon, expanding Egypt to its greatest height. Now in the process he conquered the southern kingdom of Judah, as noted on his wall of conquered Palestinian cities. The jewel in the crown was the capture of the magnificent gold and silver treasures from the Temple of Solomon, which he boasted about being able to offer to the god Amun on a wall in the Temple of Karnak. Now in exchange for tribute, the rulers of the kings of Israel and Judah were allowed to maintain a certain degree of autonomy, as long as it wasn't against the interests of the pharaoh, much like the East European nations during the Cold War when they were under the control of the Soviet Union. Now it appears that there was a revolt against this hegemony and the tribute that Judah had to pay to Egypt in Asa's reign, and a 1 million man army was sent against Judah. Now God intervened miraculously to deliver Asa and the nation of Judah. Now it says in 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 8, and it refers to the army as comprising both Cushites or Ethiopians and Libyans. Now this force was likely to have been a mercenary army of the Egyptians, who often controlled both Ethiopia and Libya. Now the word Ethiopian is translated from Cush. Now the 18th dynasty was based in Thebes in southern Egypt, and it's possible that Cush could mean southern Egypt in addition to the Sudan. Now alternatively, Zerah may have been the name of the general in charge of this army. Now the defeat of Zerah's army for a time freed the land of Israel from the hegemony of Egypt, brought about by the conquest by Shishak, and not reasserted over Judah until perhaps as late as the reign of Jehoshaphat's son Jehoram. Now the next Egyptian king after Amenhotep II was Thutmose IV. Now he boasts that he subdued Ashkelon, Canaan, and Israel in the Berlin pedestal. Now there is no mention of Judah, though it is broken off at the end. Now Thutmose IV would have ruled in the latter part of Asa's reign. Now the Bible in 2 Chronicles 15:19 indicates that Judah had peace until late in Asa's reign, when he fought Baasha of Israel. So it's unlikely that Thutmose IV challenged Asa after the disaster that befell his predecessor. Now when Jeroboam broke away with the 10 tribes, he based himself in Shechem, in between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where Israel made a covenant with God. Now the next kings lived in Tirzah, a little to the northeast of Shechem, including Omri during a brief period of divided rule, when half of Israel supported Tibni. Now when Israel was divided in the first half of Omri's reign, this may have been the time that Thutmose IV brought them back under Egypt's hegemony. The distinction between Canaan and Israel on the Berlin pedestal may be a reference to these two factions when Israel had divided rule. Alternatively, Canaan could be a reference to the Philistines north of Ashkelon. Now when Omri gained sole reign over Israel, he began to work on a new capital for the northern kingdom on a hill called Samaria to the northwest of Shechem, which continued as Israel's capital until the Assyrian conquest. Now Shechem was at the base of 2 mountains. Now Omri felt a more elevated capital would give them more protection from attack. Now at Samaria there were 2 stone benches inside the city gate entrance, and which appear to correspond to the throne benches that Ahab and Judah's king Jehoshaphat sat on, referred to in 1 Kings 22. Now Omri's successor was the wicked king Ahab, who married the even wickeder Queen Jezebel. Now Ahab went to regain lost Israelite territory to the Syrians at Ramoth Gilead. Now he was killed, and Israel was defeated. Now the Syrians under Hazael and Ben-Hadad would prove to be thorns in the side of Israel's kings with constant war. We read in 2 Chronicles 20 after Ahab's death that Ammon, Moab and Edom formed a triple alliance and crossed around the Dead Sea and up the ascent of Aziz near En-Gedi to do battle against Judah and Jehoshaphat. Now after Jehoshaphat sought God's help, he was told that God would fight his battle for him. And Jehoshaphat sent singers in the front line past Tekoa. And it turns out that the enemies had turned against each other. All Judah had to do was go out and pick up the spoils. The Moabites, who were under tribute to the northern kingdom of Israel, rebelled against Israel after Ahab's death. Now this is confirmed archaeologically on the Mesa Stela, which mentions Mesha, the king of Moab, Ahab, his father Omri, the tribe of Gad, and the house of David. Now Israel's new king Jehoram called on Jehoshaphat to assist him to deal with the revolt by Moab, who had rebuilt their army following God's deliverance of Judah near Tekoa. Now the story is told in 2 Kings 3. Now joining them was the king of Edom, indicating that Edom was under tribute to Judah. Now the hegemony that Israel and Judah had over the kingdoms of Ammon, Moab and Edom on the other side of the Jordan appears to indicate that they probably weren't under tribute to Egypt for a time. Now Egyptian hegemony was again in place over Judah sometime during the reign of Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten. We know this from the contents of the AMARNA letters, which includes letters between rulers in the land of Israel and Syria and their Egyptian overlord, the Pharaoh. Now, just when in Israel's history was this time of hegemony seen in the AMARNA letters? Now, David Roll places them in the time of Saul and David. VELIKOVSKY placed them in the time of Ahab and Jehoshaphat. Now, another view is that they should be placed in the reigns of Ahab's son Joram and Jehoshaphat's bad son Jehoram. Now, here are the differing views of the dates assigned to the AMARNA period by different revised chronologies, as compared with the background of what was happening in the land of Israel at that time. Now, VELIKOVSKY writes the following regarding the AMARNA letters, giving us a bit of an overview of them. He writes, "Only a few tablets contain fragments of epic poems. All the others are letters exchanged between the two successive kings of Egypt and their correspondents, the free kings of territories in the Middle East and Cyprus, and various vassal kings and princes or officers in Syria and Palestine. The kings in the north were not subject to the kings of Egypt, and they wrote to my brother, and signed themselves thy brother. The kings in Canaan and Syria, however, were under the sceptre of the Nile dynasty, and wrote to my king, my lord, and signed themselves thy servant. In the tablets written by the vassal king of Jerusalem to the Pharaoh, repeated mention is made of the Habaru, who threatened the land from the east of Jordan. In letters written from other places, there is reference to Habaru, but an invasion of Sargamesh. Sargas is also read ideographically Hahatu, and translated cutthroats, pillagers, and it's mentioned over and over again. In letters from Syria, the approach of the king of Hattai to the slopes of the mountains of Lebanon was reported with terror. Now, the impression received is that these invasions of Habaru from the east and of the king of Hattai from the north menaced Egyptian domination of Syria, a domination which, it was learned, actually ceased shortly after the reign of Akhenaten. In their letters, the vassals incessantly asked for help against the invaders and often also against one another. The name King of Hattai is generally understood as King of the Hittites. In a later period, that of Seti I and Ramses II of the 19th dynasty, there were great wars between the kings of Hattai and the pharaohs. Now, VELIKOVSKY identifies three key cities of the AMARNA letters as the following: Jerusalem as Jerusalem, capital of the southern kingdom of Judah; Sumer as Samaria, capital of the northern kingdom of Israel; and Gubla as Jezreel, the secondary capital after Samaria. Now, most revisionist chronologists are in agreement with VELIKOVSKY about Jerusalem being Jerusalem. Now, conventional chronology, though, has a problem with this, as the time of the AMARNA letters is believed by them to be around the 1300s BC, contemporary with the time of the early judges, when Jerusalem was still held by the Jebusites and referred to by a different name, Jebus. Conventional chronology identifies Sumer with Samira on the Syrian coast just north of Lebanon, and identifies Gubla as Byblos a little to the south of Samira on the northern coast of Lebanon. Now, revisionist chronologists are split on the identifications of Sumer and Gubla. Now, some support VELIKOVSKY's identifications of them as Samaria and Jezreel, while others express certain problems with these identifications and prefer the conventional identifications of them as Samira and Byblos. Now, personally, I think there's just a little bit more against VELIKOVSKY's identifications as there is for them, though I do firmly believe that Jerusalem is definitely Jerusalem. Now, VELIKOVSKY, who placed the AMARNA period around the 850 BC, identified Jehoshaphat as Abdi-Heba of Jerusalem, that is Jerusalem, the capital of Judah. Now, Peter James, in an article he wrote in 1978 entitled "The Dating of the AMARNA Letters," argued the case that the evidence of the AMARNA letters makes a better case for Jehoshaphat's son Jehoram being Abdi-Heber, king of Jerusalem. Now, commenting on VELIKOVSKY'S view that the Elamanna period was during the reign of kings Ahab and Jehoshaphat, Peter James wrote, Velikovsky based his comparison of the events of the letters and those of the scriptures on the identifications of Abdi-Heber of Jerusalem with King Jehoshaphat of Judah, Ribabdi of Gubla and Suma with King Ahab of Israel, and Abdi Ashurta and his son Azaru of Amaru with Ben-Hadad and Hazael, rulers of Damascus. Now, with the latter two identifications, he seems to be on the firmest ground, in that we have a succession of two rulers, both of whom are characterized in the letters and the scriptures as powerful rulers who made frequent armed incursions and conquests in the territories to the south of their kingdom. Now, the raids by the Amaru and the Elamanna letters are a good match for the constant wars of the Syrian kings Ben-Hadad and Hazael in the Bible. Now, Peter James goes on to say, Velikovsky claims that Abdi-Heber, king of Jerusalem, is to be equated with Jehoshaphat. Abdi-Heber means servant of Heber, Heber being the name of a Hittite goddess. Can one really believe that Jehoshaphat, of whom the Old Testament praises for his loyalty to the Israelite God, could also have borne this name involving a Hittite goddess? Instead, we suggested that Abdi-Heber may have been Jehoram, denounced by the writers of Kings and Chronicles as an idolater, and conceivably a worshipper of the Hurrian goddess Heba or Hebat. Now also, Jehoshaphat was a godly king, and he would not have addressed the Pharaoh as my sun god, which is known from Elamanna letter 288. Now, Peter James, in his 1978 article on the dating of the Elamanna letters, argued at that time that the evidence of the Elamanna letters makes a better case for Jehoshaphat's son Jehoram being Abdi-Heber, king of Jerusalem. He writes, all the cities accused by Abdi-Heber of participating in the Habaru uprising are to the west or southwest of Judah, with the exception of Shechem and Israel. The idea proposed by Velikovsky, then, that Abdi-Heber's letters are describing an invasion from Transjordania, that's Ammon, Moab and Edom against Jehoshaphat, is quite untenable. It is clear from his letters that rebellions are occurring in and on the border with Philistia, and that the invaders of Abdi-Heber's territories are, in the main, the Philistine rebels. Now, Philistia was quiet during the reign of Jehoshaphat, far from mentioning that the Philistines took common cause with the Moabite invaders. 2 Chronicles 17:11 records that some of the Philistines actually paid him tribute. Edom had been a tributary to Judah during the reign of Jehoshaphat, and had been ruled by his deputy. Jehoram led his territory into Edom in an attempt to crush the revolt, but suffered a serious defeat, and Edom remained independent of Judah unto this day. Moreover, the Lord stirred up against Jehoram, as Jehoshaphat's son, the spirit of the Philistines and of the Arabians that were near the Ethiopians. And they came up into Judah and brake unto it, and carried away all the substance that was found in the king's house. With the revolt of Edom and Philistia, the invasion of Judah, and the sack of his palace, Jehoram's kingdom must have been on the verge of total collapse. In one letter, EA 288, Abdi-Heber defines the extent of the revolts against his authority. Let my king take thought for his land. The land of the king is lost. In its entirety is taken from me. There is war against me, as far as the lands of Seir, and as far as Gath Carmel. All the governors are at peace, but there is war against me. Seir is a mountain to the south of the Dead Sea, and was the ancestral home of the Edomites. It was used as a synonym for Edom by the prophets. The name Gath Carmel contains the element Gath, a familiar Philistine place name. The question of the Arabians that were near the Cushites has been a vexed one for biblical scholars. Eva Danielis and Martin Seif, in their discussions of the identity of the Queen of Sheba have already drawn attention to the presence of Arabian colonies in Ethiopia, known from both literary and archaeological records. The solution to the problem of the Arabians that were near the Cushites is clear. They were simply conscripts of the Egyptian army from the Kassai lands that were on service in Palestine. We return to EA 287. With reference to the Nubians, Kassai, let my king ask the commissions whether my house is not very strong. Yet they attempted a very great crime. They took their implements and breached off the roof. If they send into the land of Jerusalem troops, let them come up with an Egyptian officer for regular service. Let my king take heed for them, for all the lands are impoverished by them. And let my king requisition for them much grain, much oil, and much clothing. The men of the land of Nubia have committed an evil deed against me. I was almost killed by the men of the land of Nubia in my own house. Let the king call them to account. 7 times, and 7 times let the king my lord avenge me. Their sack of Abdi-Heber's palace was evidently part of a concerted plan of the Philistines, timed to coincide with their invasion of Judah. And if VELIKOVSKY'S reading of Beit Shulman is correct, Philistines from Keilah entered Jerusalem and occupied the Temple Mount. To sum up, the disasters that befell Jehoram of Judah and Abdi-Heber of Jerusalem were identical. Both suffered revolts of their subject territories from Philistia to Edom. During the reigns of both, the Philistines invaded and swept right across Judah, entering Jerusalem itself in concert with the sack of the king's palace by the men of the land of Kassai, or men that were near the Cushites. These peculiar circumstances could hardly be duplicated in such detail after a period of 500 years. It is clear that VELIKOVSKY'S general placement of the AMARNA letters in the mid-9th century must be correct, and that the modification of his original model suggested here that Abdi-Heber was Jehoram rather than Jehoshaphat is preferable. Now, another interesting thing that VELIKOVSKY proposed in the AMARNA letters is that Ian Hama was the Assyrian general Naaman who was healed of leprosy. Now, Ian Hama is called by the king of Sumer to be a wise man, and all people love him. And previously the king of Sumer feared him, yet he is won over by him. In 2 Kings 5:11 we read, Now Naaman, king of the hosts of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master, and honourable. Now if Sumer was Samaria, one can see how Naaman would be more favourable to Israel after his healing. After Naaman's healing, he asked the prophet Elisha in 2 Kings 5:18, In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. The Lord pardon your servant in this manner. Now Hadad was the chief god of the Syrians, and here the god Rimmon was probably the god Ra-Ammon, the chief god of the Egyptians. Now this indicates that Naaman, like Ian Hama, was a servant of the Pharaoh who had hegemony over Syria and Israel at the time. Now this Egyptian hegemony fits what has been excavated at Samaria. VELIKOVSKY writes, The excavators of Samaria were surprised. It is significant that in our ivories there is no sign of Syrian influence, and the influence of Egypt, on the other hand, is all pervasive. There are plaques which represent Egyptian gods. The subjects on furniture are all Egyptian. Now in 1 Kings 22:39, it tells us that Ahab built himself a house of ivory. Now the prophet Amos in Amos 3:15 also spoke against the sinners who dwelt in ivory houses, from which we get the phrase ivory tower from. And further on in his book, in Amos 6:4, he spoke against those who dwell at ease on their beds of ivory. Now Edwin Teale uses two synchronisms between Shalmaneser III and Israel's kings Ahab and Jehu to support his chronology. Now they are dated 12 years apart between when Teal places the last year of Ahab and the first year of Jehu. He claims you couldn't get a tighter test of his Bible chronology. Now the first synchronism, conventionally dated to 853 BC, in the 6th year of Shalmaneser III, is the Battle of Karkar, where 12 kings allied to stop the Assyrian advance into the Levant region of Syria and Palestine. Now one king is claimed to be Ahab. Now questioning this synchronism, Dr. Floyd Jones writes, "The monolith inscription documents that in the 6th year of his reign, Shalmaneser III fought against a 12-king alliance at the Battle of Karkar during the eponymous year of DYNASTY. The inscription states that one of the kings against whom Shalmaneser III engaged was a certain AHAB. Ahab is supposed to have furnished 2,000 chariots at Karkar and 10,000 infantry. Yet, at the height of his power, Solomon had but 1,400. When Hadad II invaded Israel 5 years afterwards, Ahab could only assemble 7,232 footmen to oppose the Syrians. Now in my Bible chronology, I have Ahab's reign ending a couple of years later than Teal in 851 BC. But due to an overlap in Assyrian chronology that Eric Atchison claims allows us to synchronize all the Assyrian and biblical data that results in a reduction of the date of the fall of Samaria, I feel that the dates for earlier Assyrian kings may need to be reduced by as much as 13 years. A full 13-year reduction of Shalmaneser III's reign has him starting to rule in 846 BC, sometime after Ahab's reign. Now Jones has some good points here against the synchronism, but I do have to acknowledge a certain closeness of the names. Now on the second synchronism of Jehu paying tribute to Shalmaneser III, Jones writes, "A fragment of an annalistic text from Shalmaneser's 18th year declares that upon an incursion against Damascus, the Assyrian ruler received tribute from Jehu Amar Haumri. Also, the Assyrian black obelisk, which has 20 small reliefs engraved on its 4 sides, depicts a ruler with a short trim beard bowing to the ground in submission before Shalmaneser. The majority of Assyrian scholars conjecture this to translate Jehu, son of Omri. His personal presence, adroitness, and valour as a warrior commanded instantaneous allegiance. It evoked immense fear in those who might oppose his will. Yet most Assyriologists, chronologists, and other scholars would have us believe that the man seen fawning obsequiously before Shalmaneser is the same Jehu. We think not. Such sycophantic behaviour scarcely seems befitting so valiant a soldier. Such men die first." End of quote. Now I see no issue with the timing of their reigns. Again, there is a good name similarity. Now the I interchanges with the Y or J, and Humri is close to Omri and occur elsewhere on the obelisk as Bit Kumri or House of Kumri or Omri. Now going against this is the lack of any Assyrian incursion noted in the Bible and the nature of Jehu to bow before another king. Now also this is close to the time of the AMARNA letters in our revision of history when the area was under Egyptian hegemony. Now Jonah is said to have been called on by God to go to Nineveh around the 820s BC. Now he didn't want to go and got on a ship bound for Tarshish or Spain, where the Phoenician maritime empire that was allied to Israel had a colony. Now during a terrible storm that had the crew fearing for their lives, he was cast overboard and eaten by a great fish, to be either figuratively or literally resurrected after 3 days and nights. Now, he may have looked ghost white from digestive juices, and his appearance may have had great impact on the Assyrians, who, very surprisingly, repented when warned of impending destruction in 14 days. Now, God relented from punishing the Assyrians, which greatly annoyed the prophet, knowing how cruel a people the Assyrians could be. Now, in the Istanbul Museum is an inscription with a religious reform from the time of Shamshi Adad V, who reigned around this time. Now, the hegemony over Israel by Egypt for a brief time came to an end close to the end of the 18th dynasty. Now, God was angry with the northern kingdom of Israel because of their sins and allowed the Syrians to oppress them during the reign of Jehoahaz. Now, Jehoahaz sought the Lord, and God had mercy on them. And in 2 Kings 13 verse 5 it says that the Lord gave Israel a saviour, so that they went out from under the hand of the Syrians. Now, who was this saviour? Now remember, Shishak the first relief, assumed to be that of the biblical Shishak, contained cities mostly from the northern kingdom. Might Shishak the first be that unnamed deliverer? Well, both David Roll and Alan Montgomery believe that he was, and I'm inclined to believe them on this particular point. While Shishak captured these cities and presumably put them under tribute, it was probably a much lighter burden than the oppression of the Syrians. The next verse says that Israel continued in the sins of Jeroboam. Shishak the first campaign would be a downgrading, but not a full removal of the punishment for their sins. Now, the next king in Israel's northern kingdom was Jehoash, who ruled from 796 to 780 BC. Now, he had better luck against the Syrians than his father. Now, we also have testimony of Egypt's loss of hegemony in the area from a stealer of Assyrian king Adad-nirari III, who says that he received tribute from Joash the Samaritan. In my Bible in Egypt lecture series, I present evidence that supports VELIKOVSKY'S view that the 18th and 19th dynasties were separated by a little over 150 years, with the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties 22 to 25 ruling in between them. The 18th dynasty was followed by the Libyan 22nd dynasty as primary ruling dynasty over Egypt, followed by the Ethiopian 25th dynasty as primary rulers. And then came the 26th dynasty, who VELIKOVSKY claimed for the most part were one and the same as the mighty 19th dynasty of Seti the Great and Ramses the Great. Now, the 23rd dynasty was secondary rulers at the same time as the 22nd dynasty, and the 24th dynasty was secondary rulers at the same time as the 25th dynasty. Now, this allows for the 160 years of successive years of the Libyan 22nd dynasty and the Ethiopian 25th dynasty to fit in between about 820 and 660 BC. Now, the power of the Libyans does not seem to have matched that of the 18th dynasty, and we do not know how long the Libyans' hegemony over the land of Israel lasted. It was either broken or weakened as both Israel and Judah physically, if not spiritually, prospered during the reigns of Jeroboam II in the north and Uzziah in the south. Sometime around 750 BC, this power and prosperity was greatly weakened, as were nations right across the ancient Near East, such as Greece, Turkey, and Syria. Now, this is when the catastrophe at the end of the Late Bronze Age occurred, which is falsely attributed to the peoples of the sea, who are certainly not Philistines. Enormous earthquakes and fires are recorded over a vast amount of territory. Now, in the Bible, this catastrophe is recorded as the Great Earthquake of Uzziah. That is a type of the end-time earthquake spoken about in Revelation 16. Before this catastrophe, Israel was physically rich, and Isaiah and other prophets condemned the selfish sins of Israel and warned about punishment to come, not unlike the situation we see in the English-speaking nations, who I personally believe to be the modern nations descended from Israel. Now, one example of the idolatry and syncretism that was going on in the land of Israel at this time There's an inscription in 8th century Hebrew script that asks for a blessing from Yahweh and his Asherah, blending the worship of the true God with the pagan Canaanite fertility goddess Asherah or Ashtaroth, the Canaanite equivalent of the Babylonian Ishtar. At Megiddo, a seal was found beside the gate into the local governor's residence, engraved with Hebrew writing for the 8th century BC, which states, "Shema, the servant of Jeroboam." Now, despite the 8th century style of the script, it is conventionally assumed to refer to the first Jeroboam, who rebelled with the 10 tribes in Rehoboam's day. But it should be correctly attributed to the prosperous time of Jeroboam II, who reigned from 780 to 740 BC. Eugene Merrill, in the Late Bronze, Early Iron Age transition and the emergence of Israel, writes, "For many decades now, there has been nearly unanimous agreement that the period from 1250 to 1150 BC was one racked by chaotic upheaval and massive destruction in Palestine, especially in highland sites." Now, for those who accept the conventional chronology and an early exodus during the 18th dynasty, they believe that this destruction is from the time of the judges, when the Israelites were harassed by their neighbours. Now, for those who believe in a late Exodus date, around 1250 BC, which they say was the time of Ramses the Great, they attribute this to the time of the conquest of Israel. VELIKOVSKY, however, redates the end of the Late Bronze Age to 750 BC, and he says this destruction was that of the time of Uzziah's earthquake. Now, Amos Nur, in his book Apocalypse, Earthquakes, Archaeology and the Wrath of God, makes the following comments about the catastrophe at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Robert Drews compiled a map showing the sites that had been found in the Eastern Mediterranean that were destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age. Drews names 47 Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean sites where archaeological evidence suggests some level of catastrophic collapse. Within a period of 40 or 50 years, almost every significant city or palace in the Eastern Mediterranean world was destroyed, many of them never to be occupied again. What caused the collapse? Now, conventionally, the end of the Late Bronze Age is dated around 1200 BC, but this date should be lowered to around 750 BC to remove the artificial Dark Age gap in Greece and Turkey that was created by Egypt's overextended conventional chronology, and that gap goes between 1200 and 750 BC. So with this new date of 750 BC, we can actually find evidence for this great catastrophe in the Bible. There is in the biblical record mention of a great earthquake in the land of Israel that struck at the same time as all these other earthquakes across the Eastern Mediterranean around 750 BC. Now, it is referred to as the earthquake of Uzziah, who was a contemporary of Jeroboam II. Now, Josephus tells us the following about the earthquake in Uzziah's day. He writes, "Before the city, at a place called Arosh, half the mountain broke off from the rest on the west and rolled itself 4 furlongs, that is 880 yards or half a mile." Josephus tells us that the great earthquake during Uzziah's reign caused a mountain to move half a mile. Now, to put that in perspective, the San Andreas Fault only moved 25 feet in comparison during the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Now, archaeologists note a major difference in the culture and wealth in Palestine between the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age 1 period. Now, because of Egypt's faulty chronology, many archaeologists, accepting an Exodus date during the reign of Ramses the Great around 1250 BC, assumed the Late Bronze Age settlers were wealthier Canaanites and the poorer settlers of Iron Age 1 were the Israelites after them. Now, in the documentary The Bible's Buried Secrets, a new theory is put forth based on these faulty interpretations of archaeology. Archaeology shows that around the end of the Late Bronze Age, there is a collapse and decline of cities throughout Israel. Now, Hyksos was one focused on in the documentary, which had a lower city of poorer people below the wealthier upper city. A new form of house termed the Israelite house appears in the highlands of Israel at this time, and the pottery, though similar in style to the earlier pottery, is much more mundane and less decorated, indicating a poorer society at this time. Now, according to this new theory, the Israelites did not come into the land as outsiders and destroy the Canaanites, but were instead poorer indigenous Canaanites with plain pottery. According to the theory, the indigenous poorer Canaanites took over in the early Iron Age following the collapse of the wealthier Canaanite city-states and created a new identity different from the wealthier Canaanites that they rebelled against. Now, Ramses the Great's father, Seti, conquered a people called the Shasu close to the land of Midian. And there is a town where these people came from called YHW, close to Yahweh, one of the names of God in Hebrew. Now, according to the theory, a small band of these Shasu, slaves of Seti, escaped Egypt in the time of Ramses and journeyed to Canaan and integrated with the poorer Canaanites, now identifying themselves as Israelites, bringing with them their God Yahweh. Now, it's a wild theory that paints much of the Bible's history around the Exodus as pure fiction based on a far more humble kernel of truth. Now, such a theory is pure fiction based on a faulty interpretation of the archaeological evidence. Now, properly recorrelated, the boundary between the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age 1 is around 750 BC. Now, in the decades before it, Israel and Judah were wealthy and prosperous under Jeroboam II and Isaiah. But following Isaiah's great earthquake and the Late Bronze Age catastrophe, both Israel and Judah become rather impoverished in comparison. And Israel did not last much longer before the Assyrians conquered and exiled them. Now, in its poorest state, there is considerable instability with the royal throne of the house of the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, in less than 15 years, Israel was onto its fifth king after Jeroboam II. Now, Judah also too struggled, and at times the temple of God is mentioned in a ruined or dilapidated state. Now, following the devastation of the Late Bronze Age catastrophe, the power vacuum was filled by the Assyrians in Mesopotamia, who quickly rose to much greater power, beginning with the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III. Now, David Roll, in his book From Eden to Exile, writes the following about what was happening in Israel at the start of the Iron Age. He writes, "It has recently been realised that the material culture of the new, that is Iron Age 1, hill country settlements, that is their pottery, artefacts, lifestyle and religious practices, varied little from that of the Late Bronze Age already living in the region. Detailed studies of the pottery suggest that these newcomers came from northern Transjordan, in contrast to the biblical model, which has the Israelites coming out of Egypt and invading the Promised Land from the southern part of the Transjordan." Now, David Roll dates the start of the Iron Age a century earlier than VELIKOVSKY, around 850 BC. Now, he explains this sudden increase in population of poorer people in the hill country as refugees from the Syrian incursions by Ben-Hadad and Hazael in the Golan Heights and Gilead territory east of the Jordan during the time of Ahab and his successors. VELIKOVSKY, on the other hand, dates the start of the Iron Age to 750 BC. Now, Isaiah's earthquake was shortly followed by the Assyrians taking these tribes east of the Jordan into exile. Now, many refugees from this attack on Israel would have fled across the Jordan into the hill country. Now, these people from these tribes were from northern Transjordan, where archaeology says that hill country influx came from. Now, David Roll's date of 850 BC for the end of the Late Bronze Age still leaves a 100-year gap when applied to the archaeology of Greece. The Dark Age of Greece is still 200 years long when Peter James's date of 950 BC for the end of the Late Bronze Age is applied. Now on the right here, you can see a chart that shows how the chronologies of Greece and Turkey look when the Dark Ages are removed as per VELIKOVSKY'S chronology. The Mycenaean Age is followed immediately by Homer's Archaic Age, and the Hittite Empire is simultaneous with the Neo-Hittite period of the North Syrian city-states beginning from around 900 BC. Now there's a couple of possible contenders for Pharaoh So, who Hoshea paid tribute to shortly before the fall of Samaria. The 25th dynasty Ethiopian ruler over Egypt at the time of Hoshea was SHEBA. Now Alan Montgomery notes that Sobek-Hotep was the golden Horus name of SHEBA, and that Sobek-Hotep was probably shortened to So. Now, if there was overlap at this time with one or more of the Libyan dynasties, such as the 22nd dynasty, then So could have also been one of the later Libyan rulers in the Delta region that went by the names of either Sosenk or Ossakon. The Egyptians didn't turn out to be of any help to the northern Israelite kingdom against the Assyrians, who conquered and took away the inhabitants of the northern kingdom of Israel after destroying its capital Samaria in 709 BC. Now this later date that I have here for the fall of Samaria comes about from recognition of some previously unrecognised duplication of the Assyrian records pointed out by my friend Eric Atchison. Now once recognised, only then can all the biblical and Assyrian data be properly harmonised, which neither Thiel's nor Ussher's Bible chronologies do. Now several years later, in 701 BC, Sennacherib fought against Hezekiah of Judah. Hezekiah submitted to being put under tribute, and this is recorded in 2 Kings 18 and also on the Taylor prism that's in the British Museum. Now on that prism it reads, "As to Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke. I lay siege to 46 of his strong cities and conquered them. Himself I made a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence like a bird in a cage. Hezekiah did send me later to Nineveh 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver." Now the amount of talents of gold here is identical between the two accounts. The Taylor prism, though, has 800 talents of silver, while the Bible has only 300 talents of silver. Now it's likely that Sennacherib inflated his figures, I would imagine. Now Hezekiah would ready himself for the next time that Sennacherib would threaten Jerusalem, including constructing the tunnel that bears his name, that goes under the city of David from the Gihon spring to the pool of Siloam, that is a popular tourist attraction today. Now it helped with shoring up the water supply of Jerusalem in case of a siege. Now in the tunnel an inscription was found that described the building of the tunnel, which is now found in the Istanbul Museum. Now recently some steps were uncovered just below the escarpment near where you come out of Hezekiah's tunnel. Now the excavators of the steps now believe the original pool of Siloam was much larger than where you come out of Hezekiah's tunnel. They believe it was square-shaped and was where a very green grove of trees at the bottom of the city of David is today. Now a large pool at this spot is a much more likely place where the early church baptized 3,000 people in a day. Now the last campaign of Sennacherib in 687 BC was directed not only against Hezekiah and Jerusalem, but also against Egypt and Ethiopia. Now 2 years earlier, in 689 BC, Tirhakah, who had invaded Egypt, reinstated Sethos and put to flight Sennacherib's vassal king, Haramhab. Now when Sennacherib came to Judah for the second time in 687 BC, Hezekiah refused to submit or to pay tribute. The Ethiopian king Tirhakah stood together with his Egyptian ally Sethos at the border of Egypt, prepared to meet the threat. Sennacherib sent his messengers to Hezekiah and wrote him an ultimatum and blasphemed the Hebrew God. Then, in a single night, the Assyrian host, about 185,000 warriors, perished, destroyed by some unknown cause that the Bible says came from God. In Judah, Hezekiah was succeeded by his son Manasseh. Now, Hezekiah, knowing he only had 15 years left of his life, appointed his son a co-regent at birth. And Manasseh reigned for 44 years after his father's death in 687 BC. His father died when he was only 11, and despite how godly his father was, Manasseh turned out to be one of the most wicked rulers ever, plunging the nation into terrible idolatry. In 2 Chronicles 33, verses 11 and 12, we read how God humbled him when Ashurbanipal's army came and took him away to Babylon. Now, amazingly, he repented while in chains and bondage, and he made some positive changes when he was restored to the throne. Manasseh was succeeded by his son Amon in 643 BC. The name Amon is from the Egyptian god Amun, showing the influence of Egypt. Amon was an evil ruler who only lasted 2 years on the throne of Judah, and he was succeeded by Josiah, the last good king over Judah, who had quite a long reign of 31 years. Now, the temple had fallen into disrepair, and Josiah set about repairing it. Now, at this time, they found the book of the law, and Josiah is shocked at how much the nation had turned from God. In 2 Chronicles 35, verse 3, we find the last reference to the Ark of the Covenant. Josiah, one of the last kings of Judah around 640 BC, told the Levites, "Put the holy ark in the house which Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, built." Now let's notice two other Bible passages that seem at first to contradict each other. Now in 1 Kings 14, we read, "And it happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, he came up against Jerusalem, and he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took all away." And then in 2 Kings chapter 25, we read, "And the bronze pillars in the house of the Lord, and the bases, and the bronze sea in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans broke in pieces, and carried the bronze from them to Babylon. Also the 2 pillars, the one sea, and the bases which Solomon had made for the house of the Lord. The bronze of all these vessels was without weight." Now notice the apparent contradiction. Shishak takes everything, yet later they have the original bronze bases. Now there are 2 possibilities to reconcile these verses. Now the first is that the all that Shishak took refers to only everything that was on display in the temple, but does not include certain objects, such as the Ark of the Covenant and the bronze bases, which were hidden by the priests in a separate location, knowing that Shishak was at the gates of the city. The second possibility is that certain objects were part of Shishak's booty, but were later returned on request to the temple. Now, being bronze, the Egyptians may not have put too much value on the bronze bases and were happy to return them. Now, that probably wouldn't have applied to the Ark of the Covenant. Now, it's been suggested the Ark of the Covenant was returned after God defeated Egypt in Asa's day. Now, in recognising Shishak plundering all the temple treasure and making the assumption that this included the Ark of the Covenant, Steven Spielberg in Raiders of the Lost Ark has Shishak bringing it to Tanis, the capital of Shishak I's 22nd dynasty. And then that city is swallowed up mysteriously by the sands of the desert before Tanis is discovered, and Indiana Jones then finds the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if the Ark was captured by Shishak but wasn't returned in Asa's day, how might it have returned to Jerusalem? Might some mysterious bad things have occurred to the Egyptians that forced them to return it, like what happened when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, perhaps? Well, the closest object to the Ark of the Covenant on the wall at Karnak is the ark-shaped object you see in the bottom right there. Now, there is a noticeable difference between it and the Ark of the Covenant, and that is the missing cherubim on the top lid, which is referred to as the mercy cover. Now, this argues strongly for the Ark of the Covenant being hidden by the priests before the conquest of Shishak. Now, there are several possibilities to what happened to the Ark of the Covenant if it didn't go to Babylon. Now, one is that the priests hid the Ark in one of the many tunnels under the city of Jerusalem. Now, the apocryphal book of 2 Maccabees also talks about Jeremiah hiding the Ark in a cave on Mount Nebo. Now another possibility is that it was taken to Ethiopia, for which there's some interesting historical breadcrumbs to support that. Now, a wonderful archaeological find that dates to around the time of Josiah's reign was a couple of silver amulets found in the upper city of Jerusalem, west of the city of David. Now, when carefully unrolled, they clearly revealed a 7th century Hebrew script with the priestly benediction from Numbers 6, verses 24 to 26, that reads, "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." Now, this is the oldest original copy of any Bible verse ever found, some 400 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, sometime during Josiah's reign, hegemony over Judah went from Assyria to Egypt. Now, Ashurbanipal died around 630 BC and was succeeded by much weaker kings. Seti the Great, in the years after Ashurbanipal's death, marched into the land of Israel. Now, in Bethshan, where the excavators were able to determine the successive layers of the tell, tombs of mercenaries from the Aegean and Anatolian region have been unearthed. Rowe, the archaeologist who excavated Bethshan, wrote, "Doubtless amongst all these troops were many Mediterranean mercenaries, including the redoubtable Sheridan. These must have formed the major part of the garrison left at Bethshan by Seti." Now, the Psammetichos of Herodotus' writings is usually identified with Psamtik I of the 26th dynasty. Now, Immanuel VELIKOVSKY identifies Psamtik I as the alter ego of Seti the Great of the 19th dynasty. Velikovsky writes, "The explanation of the presence of Greek mercenaries in the army of Seti 700 years before Psammetichos is simple. Seti was the Psammetichos of Herodotus and other Greek writers, and he lived 700 years after the time assigned to him by modern historians." Now, Bethshan was besieged and occupied by Seti, and his steelers and the graves of the Greek mercenaries who served with him were discovered there. Ramses II, his successor, also occupied Bethshan for some time, and it's very telling that no vestiges have ever been found there of Egyptian kings of later times, particularly of the 26th dynasty. The Scythians, who Necho II's father met and were given Bethshan, appear in history not long after the captivity of the 10 tribes in Assyria. Historian Steve Collins tells us that the following about the identity of these Scythians who originally ventured south to the land of Israel around 623 BC in the reign of Josiah, and would later be a part of the alliance with Babylon, the Hittites and the Medes in destroying the Assyrian capital Nineveh in 612 BC. Stephen writes, "Herodotus notes that while the Scythians also conquered Media and took possession of all Asia, they marched into Palestine doing no harm to anyone. Harper's Bible Dictionary records this massive Scythian presence in Palestine occurred in the reign of King Josiah." The Scythian invasions clearly exhibit motives that confirm their Israelite origin. By conquering Media, they liberated the Israelites held captive in the cities of the Medes, and by destroying the Assyrian Empire they exacted revenge for the Assyrian destruction of the Old Kingdom of Israel. The Greeks called the Black Sea Israelites Saker or Scythian. However, the Bible calls them by their Israelite tribal names because the Jews still recognize the Scythians as Israelite tribes. That is why 2 Chronicles 34 to 35 records King Josiah issuing donation and Passover invitations to people of Manasseh, Ephraim, Naphtali, Simeon and Israel. King Josiah was in fact interacting with the Scythians who had just recently reoccupied their old tribal lands. Vernacular states that the Scythians returned to the Black Sea region within 10 years, while Herodotus records they remained in the Middle East 28 years before returning. The events of King Josiah's reign take on new meaning when it is realized that the more devout 10 tribes of Israel had reoccupied Palestine during his reign. King Josiah's spiritual reform of Judah, began in the 8th year of his reign. The 8th year of his reign was 623 BC, about when the Scythians, the 10 tribes of Israel, reoccupied Palestine. He began to destroy pagan idols and images, even though he did not recover the book of the law until at least 10 years later. Herodotus wrote that the Scythians avoided unclean meat and forbid the use of idolatrous images. After 10 to 28 years, the Israelites mostly returned to the north after discovering that Palestine was no more a land of milk and honey. It had been occupied by foreigners brought by Assyrians for a century and was now undesirable compared to the Israelites' Black Sea region. However, a few Israelites likely stayed in Palestine, accounting for limited contingents of Israelites being present in future generations. After the Scythian Israelites left Palestine, a city in the old tribal territory of Manasseh, Bethshan, was renamed Scythiopolis in honor of the Scythians who had liberated Palestine from Assyrian domination. The city was still named Scythiopolis when it was one of the cities of the Decapolis in which Jesus walked. End of quote. Now Nebuchadnezzar's father Nabopolassar of Babylon and the Medes brought the Scythians over to their side, and together their armies in 612 BC advanced from 3 sides against Nineveh, which fell. They would again combine to finish off the last remnants of the Assyrian Empire in Haran in 609 BC. Zephaniah prophesied that God would make Nineveh a wasteland and that shepherds would roam over her. Nineveh was never rebuilt, and today the shepherds of nearby Mosul graze their sheep among the dunes of Nineveh. Close to the time that the Assyrian Empire fell, Seti the Great died, and Ramses the Great took over Egypt. Now, some fantastic archaeological finds from this period were discovered in Jerusalem in the city of David. In an archive building, about 51 bullae, or stamp seals, were found. Now, half of them have names of people specifically mentioned in the Bible, including Jeremiah's scribe Baruch, Jeremiel, the king's son, who tried to seize Jeremiah, as well as a number of others. Now, with the Assyrian Empire now history, the Egyptians and the Babylonians fought for control of the Levant south of the northern Syrian cities that were a part of the Hittite Empire. This area of southern Syria and Israel would change hands back and forth between Ramses the Great and Nebuchadnezzar a few times before the Babylonians would gain ascendancy. Now, in his first campaign, Ramses the Great went to support his Assyrian ally in Haran. En route, Josiah blocked his path at Megiddo and was shot by one of Ramses' archers. He carried off Jehoahaz and put Jehoiakim on the throne of Judah. About 3 or 4 years later, in 605 BC, he went off on his second campaign, this time to fight the Babylonians and Hittites at Carchemish, where he was defeated despite the propaganda and spin he put on it in his account of the Battle of Kadesh. Now, he lost control of Judah and Syria for 3 years to the Babylonians before Jehoiakim sided with him once again at the time of his third campaign in Ramses' 8th year. And just after that, Ramses II conquered Philistia. Now, 3 years later, Nebuchadnezzar finally decided to act on this loss of hegemony and retook Judah, taking Jehoiakim captive to Babylon. Zedekiah then became Judah's final king. And in his 9th year, he turned again to Ramses the Great for support against the Babylonians. And then by this time, Nebuchadnezzar had had enough. He laid siege to Jerusalem. Now, Egypt initially went out to help Judah, but Ramses the Great met with Nebuchadnezzar and struck a deal to give up Judah for its own protection. And then Nebuchadnezzar went back to besieging Judah, which would hold out for a year and a half before breaking. After Ramses II gave up Judah, the new Hittite king Hyksos III saw an opportunity to stabilize relations with Egypt, and he struck up a treaty with Egypt. In Zedekiah's 11th year, in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and took the Jews into exile into Babylon. Now, some of the Jews were exiled earlier in 605 BC, around the time of the Battle of Carchemish, including the prophet Daniel. Now, it's from that earlier exile that the 70-year prophecy of the Jewish captivity is counted from until a few years after the Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BC, when a remnant of the Jews returned. Now, Ramses II's successor was Mereneptah, who Velikovsky identifies as the alter ego of the 26th dynasty king Apries. Now, the stela of Mereneptah, also called the Israel stela, has one of the first references to Israel outside the Bible. It states, "Israel is desolated, his seed is not." Now, this is probably a reference to the fall of Judah and their exile to Babylon. Now, the phrase "his seed is not" could easily be a reference to the slaying of all of Zedekiah's male children who were heirs to the throne of David, mentioned in Jeremiah 37. Now, Jeremiah 43 verses 6 and 7 indicates that Jeremiah escaped from Judah with at least one of Zedekiah's daughters and went to Tahapnes, or Tel Daphne. Now, Greek soldiers were based in this frontier town, which had a royal palace. At Tel Daphne, excavators were surprised to find a temple of Ramses the Great, as no artifacts of any kings between the 19th and 26th dynasties have ever been found there. Now, God actually promised to David that his throne would endure forever in Psalm 89. Now, was God's promise broken when Zedekiah and his male heirs were all killed and the nation of Judah was sent into exile, since no king of the Jews ruled over them after they returned from Babylon? Well, Irish tradition tells us that after Jeremiah and the Jewish princesses fled to Egypt, that he went to Ireland with one of the princesses where the throne was transplanted. Now, the descendants of that throne in turn then went to Scotland and then went to England, where it continues to this day with the royal throne of royal throne of Britain. And many believe that the stone of Scone that has been under the coronation throne is the same stone that Jacob used as a pillow when he saw his vision of angels going up and down the stairway to heaven. So that concludes the second lecture in this History of Israel bonus series. In the third and last one, we're going to pick up the story from the end of the Jewish exile through to the end of the apostolic era in the New Testament period.